Thank you. I thought I would start with a short reading from Detroit Breakdown, and just as a little explanation, the first two books in the series are written entirely from Will Anderson's viewpoint. So the protagonist is written first person and really is in that voice, which is mostly me. I'd like to distance myself a little more from Will if you've read my books, but there's an awful lot of me in him, and it was a pretty natural voice, although trying to adjust it for the time period. And when I was thinking about what Detroit Breakdown would be, I knew that I had to have things happen that weren't going to be within Will's experiences. Somebody else was going to have to do some of the things to solve the murder in this. And the only thing that I thought that made any sense was to have Elizabeth tell half the story. So Elizabeth has gone from Will's fiance in the first book, already done at that point, and she's had lots of personal issues, and now she's kind of back on her feet again. And I had never written from a woman's viewpoint before, and it was really challenging. My wife told me repeatedly I had no idea how women think. I was pretty clear on that already. But fortunately, she and her sister and two of my daughters helped me through the process, and telling me when women absolutely don't think that way. You need to change this. My editor started out skeptical as to whether I could do it, and she was suggesting maybe I should write third person for this other section. But I stuck with the first person because it's the way that I thought it needed to be written, and fortunately she was thrilled with it when I was finished, so that was nice. So what I'm going to read is a section that Elizabeth is narrating, and this is early in the book, and the location that's kind of central to this book is Eloise Hospital, the big insane asylum, poorhouse and tubercular sanatorium over in the Detroit area. It was where Wayne County put all of these people, and I'll talk a little bit about Eloise later on. But Elizabeth is remembering her first time that she was at Eloise, and she was supposed to be watching her cousin Robert. And in this, she just before this, she says she learned that Robert wasn't her cousin. Will scooted closer and put his arm around me. Do you want to talk about it? I picked a long blade of grass and began twirling the stem between my fingers. It was a beautiful day, I remember that. Sunny, brilliant blue sky. We were at the amusement hall watching a brass band play on stage. How old were you? 8. I didn't even have to think about it. I was 8. Robert hated the music. It was too loud for him. He hates loud noises. He covered his ears and hunched down in his seat for the entire concert. I stopped paying attention to him, especially when the band played their last number. I smiled as I remembered. They introduced a new song by John Philip Sousa, Stars and Stripes Forever. I can still see it, shifting my head from side to side to see the band around all the hats. There had to be 200 people there. When the band finished, we all stood and clapped. Then my mother leaned down to me and said, "Where's Robert?" I glanced to my right and saw an empty seat. I turned to Will. He had been right there. Mother asked me again where he was. Her voice sounded funny, tight, and nervous. Even though everyone around me was standing and applauding, I had the sensation of being the center of attention. I dropped the piece of grass and brought my hands up to my cheeks. My face got so hot. I didn't know where he'd gone. Mother shouted at me that she'd told me to watch him. I told her that I had been watching him, and I was. Somehow he slipped away. I paused. We started searching for him. She told me to go around to the right, and she went to the left. I felt absolute panic, but I didn't really want to find him. I knew if Robert didn't turn up, I wouldn't have to go back to that dreadful place. I looked down at my lap, and a tear dripped onto my dress, leaving a dark circle. Will held his handkerchief out to me. I took it, crumpled it in my hand, and looked out at the water. I didn't see the river, though. I saw Eloise. I walked to the back of the hall and down the stairs. When I reached the bottom, I thought I heard a door close below me, but I didn't think anything of it. I was sure Robert would have run out of the building, maybe toward the lake. I hurried outside to look for him. I shivered and fell silent. Will waited for me to continue. Finally, I did. He wasn't down by the lake. I started crying with frustration. I thought he'd drowned, and I knew it was my fault. Another tear slipped down my cheek. A few minutes later, Mother ran across the pavement and shouted at me, "Elizabeth, what are you doing?" "I'm looking for him," I said. "Oh my God," Mother moaned. She spun around in a circle, looking in every direction, but not seeming to really see anything. She grabbed hold of my shoulders and bent down into my face. She was hurting me. "Elizabeth," she said, "we can't lose your brother." "Oh my Lord," Will whispered. I stared at her, too stunned to say anything. I was crying hard now and choked down a sob. I told her Robert was my cousin. Mother looked back at me, as if surprised I was still there. "No, he's not," she said, and told me to wait there while she got the police. I watched her run off toward the asylum buildings, and then I walked down the shoreline, really looking into the water, thinking about Robert. "He's really your brother?" Will asked. "Yes. My father wouldn't hear of keeping a defective child, of course, so they packed him away and told me he was Aunt Theodora's son. I wondered, did that mean Aunt Theodora was my mother? But even then, I knew. Mother looked at Robert the same way she looked at me, with the love of a mother toward her child. I let out a long sigh. I must have been quiet for a while because Will prompted me. "What happened after your mother went for the police?" I thought about hearing the door close. I walked back up to the amusement hall and went downstairs. I stopped. I couldn't tell Will what had happened in that basement, ever. "Was Robert there?" Will finally asked. "Yes." I looked away from him. We got out together. "How did you find him?" "He found me and brought me out." I brushed off my hands and started to stand. "We should be going." "Elizabeth," Will took my hand and kept me there. "What aren't you telling me?" "Nothing," I said, annoyance creeping into my voice. "He found me and we left." "All right, but just know that I'll listen whenever you want to talk about it." I climbed to my feet and started back to the automobile. "There's nothing to tell. He was in the basement. The reason I'm so emotional is because Robbie is my goddamn brother, not my cousin. My parents lied to me and I lied to you." I couldn't help myself from bursting into tears again. Damn this being a woman. I'll stop there. And of course, she wasn't telling the truth either. There was a lot more to the story. So I want to thank you for coming. I appreciate not having just to talk to myself tonight, so thanks. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the history in my books. And there's a lot of electric car stuff as you go through the books. Really, sort of the base of the story is that Will is the son of the owner of Detroit Electric, which was and now has returned, but was the most successful electric car company in U.S. history. And that's a picture of what their factory looked like in 1910, 1911. This is on Clay Avenue or Clay Street, whatever, in Detroit. If you know the Russell Industrial Complex in Detroit, that's right where it is, kind of close to Hamtramck and in the very industrial area. The company was actually at this time called the Anderson Carriage Company, and carriages were their big business. They did high-end stuff, opera coaches, kind of like Cinderella coaches. That was a big part of their business. And they had hundreds of models, from buckboard wagon, kind of basic looking things, up into these really elaborate vehicles. And so everybody who was in the carriage business at this time figured they got to get into the automobile business because everybody could see the writing on the wall. At the turn of the century, there were actually more electric cars on the road in the United States than there were any other kind of car. And the second most common at that time was the gasoline engine. You know what the third was? Any guesses? Bicycle? No, for something with a motor that would go. Steam. Yeah, steam was, going back even farther, was the most popular. People could figure that out. That's how they would, end up running trains. They'd have these locomotives and they'd have boilers and get those boilers going. And so that's what they were doing with the steam cars. And they were really fast. But it took 45 minutes to get the fire up to where you could actually run the thing. So that was a little inconvenient. And then you had to have a train engineer's license in order to be able to drive one. So that kind of faded away quickly. But at this time, so with Detroit Electric, this is carriage factory, this is automobile factory. So even while they were making this transition, in 1910 they became the biggest electric car manufacturer in the United States. But even at that time, they did a lot more business in carriages and coaches than what they did in automobiles. So this is a photo from the Detroit Electric 1910 sales catalog. They have great sales catalogs that I got a ton of information from. But one thing that's really interesting, if you look through any of the manuals or sales literature for any car company that didn't make electrics, all you see are men. Men were the drivers. And just in general, men were the drivers. It was not ladylike to drive. Even to drive a coach or a carriage, it wasn't ladylike. So it was the more modern, out there kind of women who would drive. And the reason that they went toward electrics is because you could just start it by flipping a switch rather than having to go around to the front of it and start cranking that gas engine to get it started. That was very unladylike, and even these modern women just couldn't see really doing that. It was also dangerous. A lot of people got injured. A number of people were killed when they're trying to start a car. You had to do it just right because it wasn't unusual for the engine to kick back, and when that happened, it would snap that handle back up and hit you wherever it might be. Eventually, there was this term called Ford elbow, which they called that, it's like tennis elbow from trying to start your car and then having your arm jerked way back. So women were the target market for the electrics, and that was for the good and for the bad. The good part being that they had this ready market, because at this point the middle class was this sliver. You had this massive group of poor people and this tiny group of rich people, and the rich people were buying cars. Poor people, not a chance. I mean, these cars, this car here would have taken the complete salary for probably 3 years of a laborer. So it was just prohibitive. They would walk. Maybe if they were well-to-do, they'd have a bike. Otherwise, if they had longer distances, they'd take a train, or if inside the city, take a streetcar. But they didn't have cars. So it was just these two groups. Men, they want gas cars. They can drive it out in the middle of nowhere, do whatever they want, live according to their own schedule. Women, the electrics were the thing. So one thing that I think is interesting, if you look at the interior of this, we've got this woman sitting here and facing out the door. And that's the way that seat was set up. It's a bench seat that's stuck in the corner. This is the front of the car. Okay, so in a spot that you might think she'd want to be facing the front, she's facing diagonally kind of toward the back. And then this is a jump seat. So when you're getting in and out, that would flip up, and you just leave it flipped up unless you had 4 people and needed to use it. So that's the other front seat. There's 2 front seats. Neither of them are facing the front. They're both facing the back. Seems kind of strange. But you think about it, the paradigm at this time was a coach. And in a coach, you've got people in the front that face the people in the back. The people in the back face the people in the front. That's just the way transportation worked. And so that got translated then into these things. And so you have, with the front being here, so this is a limousine. Pretty nice, huh? The driver sits in the back seat, so literal back seat drivers. And the passengers would sit over here and over here. And so there's really no spot you could put a steering wheel because, it's not sitting up against something, it's the back seat. And so this thing right here is a steering tiller, and that would fold either down or up against the side when you weren't using it. And then you'd take it, have it in front of you, and when you pushed it out, you'd turn left, and when you pulled it back, you'd turn right. It all, kind of made sense. And there are a couple of pedals down here, but they're both brake pedals, so it's a front and rear brake. The accelerator is this thing right here. There's a little shift knob, and they would go from first speed at about 4 miles an hour up to 6 speed, which would go, depending on the model, around 25 miles an hour. And that was as fast as you wanted to drive on the roads at that time anyway. And if you think about it, if you had like I don't know how fast horses run, but it can't be much more than 25 miles an hour. So this was like breakneck speed to be riding in a car at 25. It just, would seem like you were going incredibly fast. So that was fast enough for everybody. And once you got outside the cities, the roads were all dirt anyway. And even within the cities in 1910, most of the roads were cobblestone and, in varied condition, depending on if rich people were to drive down them. Then the city officials would make sure those were in good shape, but the rest of them, who cares? It's just those poor folks. With the interior, a couple of things to note. The Bud vase. We all have Bud vases in our cars, don't we? This is a watch that's built in. And on the other side, they had what they called a toilet case, a makeup case. So really designed very much for the female and very upscale sort of client. This is a Detroit Electric garage on Woodward Avenue in 1910. There was a really good article in a magazine that was revolving around the Detroit Auto Show of 1911. And they had like a 4 or 5 page article about the Detroit Electric garage. And I hadn't really thought before, if you lived in the city and prior to the automobile, if you were well-to-do, you had a carriage or coach, you had something. And of course that had to be pulled by horses. Unless you were really, really wealthy, you didn't have a barn or carriage house and all these things that you needed, grooms and so on. And so you'd keep your horses and carriage at a livery stable. And so when people switched over to cars, they didn't have anywhere to put those either. And the paradigm was this transportation thing went away when you weren't using it, and when you needed it, then you called up. So what these guys would do is they had a job called a chaser, and what the chasers would do is you'd call, or pre-telephone, you'd send a boy down to tell him that you needed your car, and the chasers would take a freshly cut flower and put it in the bud vase. They wore one-piece spotless white uniforms, white gloves, and they would drive the car to your house. They'd lock it up in front of your house because you had your own key, and then they would take a streetcar back to the garage. And when you were done, they would come back, they'd wash it, they'd feed it by hooking it up to the electric to power it. And it really, you had your car living like a horse in a stable, really that same idea. So these are all charging stations that are set up all the way around here. And just this one garage on Woodward had an average of 150 cars a night, and they had 2 other garages in Detroit. People who were very well-to-do, and Henry Ford is a good example because he owned, over the years, he owned 3 different Detroit Electrics that were Clara's. 2 were Clara's and 1 was Edsel's. And he put a charging bay in his garage so that they didn't have to deal with this nonsense. Yeah?
So how long would the car last? I mean, could you drive it to another town? Or
good question.
2 hours or what?
The batteries that they used originally were lead acid batteries, which is the same kind of battery you've got in your car that starts your car. And pretty much anywhere that there was space, they jammed batteries in there. And they would get they guaranteed 50 miles on a charge. And most of the cars at that time, you could get about 100 realistically, but they were guaranteeing 50. And then in 1910, Thomas Edison came out with a new battery, and that was a nickel steel battery, a different design, and that they could guarantee 100 miles to the charge. The electric car companies have been waiting for almost a decade for him to finally introduce this. This is what they were all waiting for. That was going to be the thing that was going to make the electric car business, and it didn't make much difference, unfortunately. It was at the time, like these cars at the top end cost about $3,500, which an average workman at the time made $1,000. But well, that's not true. An average worker, period, blue collar, white collar, whatever, made about $1,000 a year. It was $1, $1.25 a day for a laborer. So, and that's and that's 6-day week, but they only had to work 9 hours a day because it had been shortened. So, you could make $8, $10 a week if you worked hard, and you got Sundays off. So what was there to complain about? And I've completely forgotten where I was. Oh yeah, so you've got, anywhere from $2,000 to $3,500 in 1910 for a Detroit electric car, and to add the Edison batteries was a $600 upcharge. So it was very expensive to add those in there. And by 1912, Detroit Electric had an exclusive on that battery. Initially, it was being sold to the other electric car companies too. But they managed to get an exclusive, which, by that time, their sales were still growing, but just, they're growing very slightly year after year, while gas cars are just going like this because they were way cheaper. Model Ts, when they came out, was, I think, $850 in 1908. They got down in the 20s to $295. Even with inflation, they were, practically free. As that middle class was developing, they were able to buy those cars, and Ultimately it's what led to suburbs and the destruction of the inner city and all that good stuff. But Henry Ford was growing his customers by having them work for him and having all the other companies have to follow suit. They created really the middle class. Okay, so Eloise Hospital. As I've done research about the Detroit area over the years, I'd come across mentions of Eloise, and the name always hit me. What a bizarre name for a hospital, and so it just kind of stuck in my head. And I kept coming across mentions, and I've talked to a lot of people over there, just with the presentations that I do and stuff. And I had people ask me, "Have you thought about doing anything about Eloise Hospital?" And they'd tell me, their great aunt was a patient there for, lived there for 40 years or something, and they'd go visit, and it was the scariest place they'd ever been. And I think this resonated with me because of the state hospital. Growing up here, that was such a scary place. My brothers and I thought that the water tower was where they kept the really crazy people, up on the top. We were absolutely convinced of that. And, it was frightening. And, it's just one of those things as a kid, the stuff you don't know about is the scary stuff, and that was scary. So this is the main asylum building at Eloise. This is about 20 miles outside of the downtown area in Detroit. It's actually within 5 miles of the Detroit International Airport. That same exit that you'd get off I-94, you just turn the other way, away from the airport, and in a couple of miles you hit Michigan Avenue, take a right, and what's left of it is right there. So Michigan Avenue lies between the lake and the main asylum building. And, as you can see, pretty imposing structure, and a very scary thing to be driven up to, and, often in the back of a paddy wagon. This is Eloise. That sweet little girl got an insane asylum named after her. She wasn't crazy. And it is a very weird story. There's a book, if you're interested in the history of Eloise Hospital, there's a book that you can get on Google eBooks that's free, called The History of Eloise, I believe is the title. And it was written in 1912, published in 1913, so the timing for me was perfect. And it goes through the buildings that were there at the time, the history of the place, the patients and inmates that were there, some of the information about the doctors who worked there. It was really helpful for me trying to piece together what Eloise was at the time, and then I threw it all out and cheated anyway. I'll tell you about some of that. But it went through where the name came from, because I had read everything I could find, and I couldn't find anything that said anything about the name. The board in the 1880s wanted to put in a post office, and in order to have a post office, you have to have a name. And the name of the place at the time was the Wayne County Mental, I don't even remember. It was a big long name. You can't have a post office with a big long name. It's got to be short. So they couldn't do that, so they started proposing names they thought made sense. And this is just the post office, because they had enough mail coming in now that it was too inconvenient not to have a post office. This was not to name the hospital. And so they submitted a bunch of names to the Postal Service. They were all rejected. They sent a bunch more, all rejected. They were either too long or they were too close to the name of another post office in Michigan. And so finally, out of frustration, the board put in the names of all of their wives and sent that in. Those were all rejected. So Freeman Dickerson, who was the president of the board, decided that he would put in his lovely 4-year-old daughter Eloise's name, and it was accepted. And, he's thinking, kind of funny, she'll grow up with a post office named after her, that's kind of cute. Well, all the mail is being addressed to Eloise, 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 and everybody started calling it Eloise. And right about this time is when they just went, whatever, they made the official change to Eloise Hospital. So I think it was 1912 that they made the conversion, even though everybody had been calling it that already for decades. So Eloise lived in Detroit her whole life, and died in 82, which was shortly after they closed down the psychiatric part of the hospital. Here's a postcard, and one of the things that we've kind of lost over the years is postcards. Everywhere every restaurant, hotel, tourist spot, anything you went to, they always had postcards you could buy. And you'd get the postcard and write your little message to the people back home and stick it in the mail. So if you were going to visit Eloise, you could buy a postcard from them of the place and this, nice idyllic pastoral scene. That was not like the experience that most people had there. Although one guy I talked to was really interesting because I was showing this and he came up to me afterward and he said, that's how I remember Eloise. I had my family, he lived very close to it, and he said every Sunday we went to Eloise to have a picnic. And so, what he remembers is the lawns and, these nice experiences that he had with his family. Virtually everyone besides him I've talked to had not as positive an experience. Although one lady who runs the Eloise Museum now, such as it is, her mom was a nurse there, and every summer the nurses' kids would all have to spend the day at Eloise because there was nothing to do with the kids. And she said that they used to get such a kick out of going down to the front gate and looking over Michigan Avenue, and when cars would come by, they'd shake the bars and scream gibberish, acting like they were crazy, and they'd say people would just go back, drive, and try not to actually pay attention to them. So she had a lot of fun with that whole idea. Most people, though, would tell, the stories are so sad, it would be the aunt that lived there for decades and, really was just kind of put there and forgotten about. That's, I think, the more normal story. This was the original administration building, which in the research, challenging to figure this place out because the buildings were added onto constantly and the names changed. Building A ended up being later on Building D, and Building D that was the main asylum became Building B, and they just kept adding on more and more buildings until actually during the Depression they were sprawled out over 900 acres. There were 75 buildings, and at a time, more than 10,000 patients and inmates. So you think about, how huge that place was. And it was self-sufficient, had a farm, both growing crops as well as animals, slaughterhouse, of course, cannery, bakeries. They had 16 kitchens that were serving over 30,000 meals a day. So the place just got huge. Now, and this is during the Depression, and it was mostly the indigent of Wayne County that made their numbers balloon so much. They started out as a poorhouse, and it continued as a poorhouse until poorhouses went away. I don't know when that was, sometime after the Depression. And that was its first function. Then they added the insane asylum, and then they added the tubercular sanatorium.
When you say they were self-sufficient, were any of the inmates or the people who lived there, were they working the farms?
Yes.
They did the manual labor there?
Yes.
As opposed to outside
Yeah.
contractors, if you will?
Yep, they had and just as a point of terminology, because it seemed wrong to me, when I was writing the book, I was reversing what they called people. The inmates were the tubercular patients, and also the people in the poorhouse. The patients were the insane, kind of the opposite of, the way that we tend to think of the word inmate, but that's what they did. And anybody who was able to work worked, either farms, kitchen, cleaning, doing something. Yeah.
So really, it was established as a poorhouse?
Yes.
And that's why it was so self-sufficient. So what was it called then?
It was the Wayne County Poorhouse.
It was called?
Yeah, and that was like 1830, I think, that happened. And they bought an old saloon, a coach stop in the middle of nowhere, and figured that that's where they would stick the poor. And shortly after that, then they added manacles and chains, and then they started sending the mental patients there too. And one thing that was nice about this, actually, in some ways, it was bad for me, but nice for the patients. Right around this time period, around in the early 1900s, is when psychiatry really started waking up. That this wasn't just about getting these people stuck away. They started thinking about treatment. And some of the treatment was awful, and Eloise was a pioneer in those treatments. And some of it was great and really worked. They were really working on psychotherapy at this time, and all the big psychiatrists in Detroit would be consulting at Eloise. But during this time period, they were experimenting with radiation therapy for tuberculosis. And some of the records that I've seen indicate that they were trying it on some of the mental patients as well, which is why Will gets his worst yet punishment for being my protagonist in Detroit Breakdown with radium. And I'll talk about radium because that led me down this whole other rabbit hole of weird stuff. This is the chapel in Building A, and this is actually in 1912 where they would have done the performance that I was reading about at the amusement hall. The amusement hall hadn't been built yet, but for the purposes of my book, I needed it to have been built back in the 1880s. So it was. This is another building that is in the book, the double residence. And this is where the administrator of the hospital lived. He lived on half. And then at the History of Eloise, that book, the guy who was writing the book lived in the other half. And they had varied people who lived in it over the years. But I was glad I had the picture because it let me get a good mental image. There's quite a bit in the book that happens there, none of it good for Will. And then the amusement hall and storeroom. The lower level of the place was storeroom, and they built two basements that they would keep their stores in. And this is on the lake side. Everything but the crop farm was on the opposite side of Michigan Avenue. They built the lake. There's a branch, the south branch of the River Rouge runs through the other side of the property. And so they ran water pipes from the river over to this side of Michigan Avenue where they dug out a hole. And first they had a pond and they kept expanding it, and it got bigger and bigger. And it's still there, although it's very small now, and you don't see it unless you climb up the little hill that's on the side of the road now. But I needed the amusement hall because I included in the book some parallels with the Phantom of the Opera, and because it was fun. And I put in some clues that relate to the Phantom of the Opera novel that no one here has read, and I wouldn't recommend it because I thought it would be fun. And so I found some parallels there that I could include, but I couldn't have an opera house on the the site of Eloise Hospital, but I couldn't have an amusement hall, the next best thing. So that's why this had to be there. It created some issues for me because I had to get Will and Francis, this kid that he sort of befriends, from the main part of the asylum, which was all fenced off, and across the road, which led to a little bit of, well, it led me into changing a few other things about the hospital as well, which I'll talk about. Schoolhouse, they built it for the kids of the poor, and eventually they sent them all away. And so they just would keep the adults there, and the kids would all go to other institutions, and they used it for the patients and inmates for a while, and then it really just kind of fell into disuse. But it's in the book. The county house. So this was the last of the poor houses, and you can see how huge it is. But in the Depression, they had every building in the place. They had mattresses that they would put out in the halls at night because they didn't have nearly enough room for everybody. So there were people sleeping everywhere. Initially, when they started doing the tuberculosis treatments, the thought was that fresh air was the thing that people needed. And so they built these tents, and year-round they would have the patients living in these tents. And it got very cold, but they thought the fresh air was what they needed. And then in 1911, they built these two wings around the outside where the tents used to be. And on one side were the men, the other side the women, and they were racially integrated, which I thought was interesting, very unusual for the time period. They had two different railway stations there. The Michigan Central Station was for freight, and that was at the back end of the place. And then they had a Detroit United Railways streetcar stop that was in the front right by the lake. And they had Michigan Central originally had that track, but Detroit United Railways was buying up everything. They had a complete monopoly of Detroit, and they started spreading it out into what they called interurban trains. And Eloise was one of their early additions there too. Fire department. And then their most famous resident. Everybody knows Elijah McCoy, I know. You've used his name many times. Right? You all know Elijah? No? The real McCoy! So they say this is the guy that it came from. He invented an oil cup for locomotives. And apparently this was really special, and it was knocked off by all these other companies. I'm not sure if this story is even remotely true, but this is what they say. And so when people were repairing their trains, they didn't want to get these fakes, they wanted the real McCoy. So they say. Now, I've also seen references to the real McCoy that go back way farther than this guy, so it could be they made it up. But in what remains of the hospital now, they have his picture up, and it's like a little shrine to the one famous guy.
Was he black?
He was, yeah, and he was one of the very few successful black inventors during the 1800s. And it was, I think, 1870s that he invented this oil cup, and that made him pretty well-to-do. But he was schizophrenic, is how he was diagnosed anyway. I think he heard voices. And so they locked him up here, and he spent the last 10 or 15 years of his life at Eloise. And they're very proud of him. Tunnels. Tunnels are really a pretty much ideal arrangement for a novelist writing about an insane asylum. because how does it get any better than thinking about walking around in these tunnels underneath the place? They weren't there in 1912. I had to get them across the road somehow. We needed tunnels. So tunnels got put in, and then when I was finding out all this information about the water pipes that went from the river to the lake, I thought, well, the tunnels don't have to go all the way. We can just get them to one part of it, and then they're going to have to take the water pipes if they want to get any farther. And Will's gotten a little claustrophobic, so I was really ratcheting up his difficulty. But the tunnels came in over the years as they continued to add on to these buildings. They started putting in the tunnels. So why would they have done it? Why do you have tunnels underneath one of these places? The weather, yeah. That was a huge part of it. If you're bringing food, supplies, whatever, from one building to another, and in the middle of a snowstorm, makes it a whole lot easier to do. And the other part of it is the bodies, because they had tens of thousands of people who died there. And you think about it, if you had even 5,000 people living there, there's no children, and there's lots of older folks. There's, health care was, even though it's a hospital, was not great. So there were people dying all the time, and they didn't want to be carting these bodies around where everybody would be able to see them. So they had a tunnel that went out to the cemetery. And I'll show you the cemetery. So this is what's there now. This is the K. Beard Building. I was there on a lovely summer day, as you can see in the picture. And this is the last administration building. And the Wayne County Council on Aging has a little tiny office over in the corner. They use 5% of the building, maybe, and the rest of it is abandoned. And they think, when last I talked to them, which was about a year ago, they were expecting to be moved and the building razed at some point in the not too distant future. There are 4 buildings that remain. The fire department. The only one that's in use is that K. Beard building. So this.
Mental hospital?
No, it's the Wayne County Council on Aging, just their administrative group. I think they just, they had a building, and there are some other newer buildings that are another part of Wayne County Social Services. I don't know exactly what they are, that are nearby.
Health Department is on the north end of the property, I think.
Okay, yeah, so that would make sense. The property now, everywhere that across the street, across Michigan Avenue, where the crops were and the lake and all that, that's all just vacant property now. And most of the property that the buildings were on is now part of a golf course. Looks like a pretty nice golf course. And, most of this place is just long gone. That's what's left of the lake. And you'd never know it was there unless you climb up this hill on the other side of the road. The Dynamo Building is up in here, and that building stayed the same. They changed how it worked. It was, steam for everything initially, eventually became an electrical station. And then back behind it, we kind of wandered around, and there's these ruins there as well. And then the cemetery, there are about 7,100 bodies there, they estimate. And there's no names on the stones, and the indexes of the numbers and letters that designate them are long gone, so nobody knows who's where. The original cemetery was right where Michigan Avenue is, and so in 1910 they dug up all the bodies that were there and moved them to the current cemetery. And it's really just abandoned property now. So that's that place. So I had mentioned that looking at this radium therapy and stuff sent me down this very weird rabbit hole that I had no idea had even existed. So the new miracle cure of the early part of the 20th century was radiation. And in my books, I have Will talk about this place. He's being told by a variety of people that he needs to take the rest cure for this neurasthenia disease they think he has, which is, depending on who you talk to, is either equivalent of depression or chronic fatigue syndrome, I've heard somebody say recently. It was this combination of symptoms that primarily women had, although men also suffered from it. It was also known as Americanitis because the world thought it was just funny that all these Americans were getting this thing and they had no idea what it was. But in it's been over the period of time, there were these healing waters. You'd go to the place that had the hot springs and people would go there and they'd get healthy and go off. And right around 1900, scientists discovered that most of them were radioactive. They had radon gas coming up through that volcanic activity that created the hot springs. And radon gas is the byproduct of radium as it deteriorates. So they went, okay, healing waters have radiation, therefore radiation is what's healing people. Makes sense. And so they started coming out with these products, and I have to read a few of these things. So this thing looks like a water, what do you call it? Yeah, like a water crock. This is the Revigator. They sold tens of thousands of these things, and what this did was it was lined with either radium or uranium, depending on the brand that you got. Well, it makes sense.
And then water from the hot springs?
Yeah, advertised by the company as an original radium ore patented water crock. And this particular one, the brand Revigator, sold more than 100,000. The company's brochure said, "Results overcome doubts. The millions of tiny rays that are continuously given off by this ore penetrate the water and form this great health element, radioactivity." All the next day, the family is provided with 2 gallons of real, healthful radioactive water, nature's way to health. So you would, they recommended that you would use hydrant water or something equivalent because that was the good water, which I thought was interesting. And they suggested that you drink 6 glasses or more daily. And lots of people did this. This is another way of doing the same thing. So if you didn't want to spend the big bucks on the Revigator, you could just buy this emanator, radioactive cone, and you could put that in your own water crock to make your water healthy. So that was that one. Radithor. There was a guy who dropped out of Harvard Medical School, although he never admitted that he dropped out, who came up with this water. And he was a brilliant marketing person. And this had as much radiation in it as 2 gallons that you would normally get out of the Revigator. And it was sold primarily by prescription. And doctors got a 17% kickback of the prescription money. So you'd buy a case of it for $30, a lot of money, and 17% went to the doctor. So lots of doctors prescribe this regularly for health. And there was a guy named Eben Byers who in the 20s, he fell off a train berth. He was a very, very well-known socialite, playboy, industrialist kind of guy. And he hurt his arm when he fell out of his train berth. He went to his doctor. Doctor said, take some Radithor, that's going to fix you right up. So he did. He liked it. And so he went on a regimen. You were supposed to drink 1 bottle a day. He thought 1 bottle is good. I'm going to drink 3. He drank 3 to 5 bottles a day for years after that. And initially, he felt great. He thought it made him feel better. And then his health started to deteriorate. And about 6 years, I think, after he started taking it, he died. And the article, his obituary in the Wall Street Journal, the headline was, "The radium water worked until his jaw came off." So that's Eben Byers, mainly what he's remembered for today. Radium bath salts. If it's not enough to get it in you, you got to get it all over you too. And this was good for nervous disorders, insomnia, general debility, arthritis, and rheumatism. Radium tablets. This is circa 1920. Manufactured and guaranteed by the Radium Remedies Company of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Quoting the manufacturer's instructions to users, Radio X tablets without gripe, pain, or loss of a meal, or 1 minute's time, will dissolve the clogging of the gall ducts, always a problem I have, enabling the liver to throw off its secretions, putting everything through their proper channels, leaving the system in a natural and healthy condition. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, and it never really hit with the mainstream medical crowd, fortunately. But there were lots and lots of these products, and there was no regulation that made them illegal at the time. So best of all, the Vita Radium suppositories. And this is primarily for men. And listen between the lines to their advertising, because this was a very common marketing ploy for radium products. So this is from their brochure. Weak, discouraged men now bubble over with joyous vitality through the use of glands and radium. Properly functioning glands make themselves known in a quick, brisk step, mental alertness, and the ability to live and love in the fullest sense of the word. Wink, wink. Love. Get it? A man must be in a bad way indeed to sit back and be satisfied without the pleasures that are his birthright. Try them and see what good results you get. All home product customer orders are shipped in a plain wrapper for confidentiality. So this was the Viagra of the 1920s. And lots of people, lots of men bought this for their issues and tried it out. I don't know of anybody, I haven't seen any testimonials, so I'm not sure how well that worked, but by the late 20s, people were starting to get the idea that this stuff was really bad for you. But even in the 60s, you could buy children's chemistry sets that had radioactive materials in them. I mean, you'd think after World War II, we'd pretty well got the idea this stuff was bad for you. But there are places around the world, even today, that you can buy radioactive health products. Pretty weird. The spinthariscope. Kind of like a kaleidoscope, right? The thing that you turn And you watch the thing, the colors change and all of that. So this was something that you would buy for parties. It was very popular with like young adults because in order to use it, you had to have the lights down. And this is during a time period where boys and girls were never together alone, and certainly never with the lights down. So this gave them an excuse. And what this is on this end a little magnifying glass, and on the other end, this is about 1.5 inches to 2 inches long, is a little piece of radium. And so you would hold that up to your eye, and you'd watch the radium deteriorate. And as it did, you would see these little sort of sparks like shooting off, which was the radon gas being created. And it was this really pretty blue color. And so it was a very popular party toy for people. So you can see there 1903, and those things were around for a long time. So that's that. What kind of questions have you got? Cars, publishing, writing, radiation.
So what does the breakdown refer to in Detroit breakdown?
The breakdown really is Will's condition. I was telling Jim earlier that when I came up with the title for Motor City Shakedown, it was from the Jay Giles song Detroit Breakdown. That's where it occurred to me. And Motor City Shakedown, obviously it's the Motor City, and there's these gangsters who are shaking down Detroit Electric. So hey, that's perfect. And then I'm thinking Detroit Breakdown. Okay, well there's mental institution issue there somewhere, and that may have been what got me thinking more about Eloise Hospital than anything else, just wanting to use the title.
So was it a trilogy, like do I need to read the first two, not just read 3?
No.
Maybe a little insight into Will.
Yeah, they do, and I think with any series, starting with the first book is the best idea. But the reviews, I try to make it so that the books can be picked up as a one-off and make sense. And reviews have said that people that hadn't read the first book or the first two books will have read the third and said, yeah, this all works just fine as a standalone. But I think the Detroit Electric scheme especially sets up the characters, and I think there's a lot of explanation in there as to why the characters are who they are in the further books. And I just finished the fourth book in the series. Yep. That's called Detroit Shuffle, and that's going to come out in the fall, I think September, although I don't have a publishing date yet. And that's set during the 1912 presidential election. I had to fit 3 books in 1912 because Motor City Shakedown really should have been 1912, 1913, but the publisher wanted it for the second book. And so I had to kind of squeeze down the mob war all into 1912 rather than carrying over to the 2 years. And I wanted to get this story of the presidential election because there's just a great corruption story that follows through this, both in Detroit and in the state of Michigan during this election. And so I just have one after another Will being abused. But in Detroit Shuffle, the real events that shape it, in the summer, there was this big sting in Detroit, completely politically motivated. So you've got the Democrats, the Republicans. The Democrats are in power locally, so it's a Democratic mayor. And there's a very strong Republican contender who's the secretary of the city council. So this is alderman days. So these guys are all aldermen. And this guy, Honest Tom Glennon, I love the name, especially in the context, was this mayoral candidate. And he was looking really strong. But the mayor and the mayor's supporters knew this guy was a crook because they all were crooks. That was not hard to figure out. And so they set up this sting where they said the Wabash Railroad wanted to expand their rail hub in Detroit. In order to do that, they were going to have to buy up a city block of houses and raise them. And they had to get permission from the city to do it. And so the aldermen involved, their question is, what's it worth to you? You know, what are you going to pay me to do this? And so there was no expansion of the rail terminal. This was all totally a sting. And they brought in this detective agency, the William J. Burns Detective Agency. And William Burns was known as America's Sherlock Holmes. That's what all the newspapers called this guy, because he solved all of these unsolvable crimes. He would get confessions from people that, you know, had been given the third degree, they'd been in prison for years, and he would somehow miraculously get these confessions. And nobody knew how he did it until right about 1912. And the Detroit case became one of the things that really popularized what he was doing. It's the first cases of wiretapping. What they had was initially, they had this thing called a dictograph. It was invented for dictation. But what they would do is they would wire a microphone. They called it a sound collector. Like if it was in the prison, they'd wire it somehow to the cell. And then they would be wired back to the machine. And the machine had a telephone receiver on it that you could hold up here and listen. And then you could write down everything that they were saying. So that was their initial use. And then there was a recording device called a telegraphone that they figured out, hey, we can take the dictograph, hook it up to the telegraphone, and it was a wire recorder. So they could actually record the voices, which is what they did in this Detroit case. So they brought in every alderman into this special office that was not a Wabash office that they said was. And this guy whose name was Walter Brennan, seriously, was the detective who was playing the role of the Wabash official, and he would get them to make their bribe demands. And they had every alderman in the city come in, and I think there were 19 aldermen, and no, there were 20-some. Anyway, 19 of them made bribe demands on the recording. And so they would make the demand, they'd give them the money, they'd walk out the door and get arrested. And they just had one after another coming in and getting arrested. And so 19 of the aldermen, including Honest Tom Glennon, who, as the secretary of the council, deserved the most. He wanted $1,000. He walked out of the office with $1,000 in his pocket, absolutely red-handed. They've got a recording of him. They catch him with the money. They had written down the serial numbers of all the bills. I mean, no doubt whatsoever this guy's guilty. That goes all the way to 1914, and this is 1912 summer. This happens, and he's the one they know they've got, and they've already, just by arresting him, they've smeared him enough that he doesn't run for mayor. But they decide. I think they came up with 9 that they thought they could take to trial and win. And they were going to start with Glennon because they had everything on the guy. So the defense lawyers are, they're delaying. Finally, 2 years later, it goes to trial. And the jury's out for 45 minutes, comes back not guilty. It's Detroit.
It hasn't changed.
Yeah. So they dropped all the rest of the cases, and that was the end of that. So that's the one part, is this alderman thing and this super high tech. I mean, this was cutting edge technology. And so I thought, it'd be really cool to make this kind of a techno thriller and get in this high tech stuff. And so I get Will with a dictograph and a telegraphone trying to get recordings on this other issue. And both the Detroit alderman scandal is very much involved in the book, as well as the other, which was that Michigan had a constitutional amendment on the ballot that year for women's suffrage. And there were 5 other states that had it on their ballots. Three states won, 3 states lost. In Michigan, it was a foregone conclusion it was going to win. The outstate Michigan was mostly Protestant, and Protestants were in favor of prohibition for the most part. Catholics were not in favor of prohibition. Women's suffrage and prohibition kind of became the same issue because men after work would go to the saloon and they would get loaded and go home and beat up on their wives. That's pretty much the standard behavior pattern of the time. And so, women had no political power whatsoever. They had no rights. And there was this huge problem with abuse in the home that was really kind of considered the man's right. And so as they started trying to work through that problem, very clearly they thought prohibition is the only way to make this go away. And women were really this leading group. There was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was a huge national force. And so you've got this huge group of outstate people who everyone is sure is going to vote for suffrage because they think women should have the vote. They think prohibition is a good idea. And then in the cities, primarily, you had these groups of Catholic immigrants who like to drink. And they probably like to beat on their wives. But regardless, they were not in favor of prohibition. And so they were not in favor of suffrage. But no doubt it's going to pass. Well, it lost. And the governor and the governor-elect both demanded a recount. They went through and they found that there were tens of thousands of ballots that were missing. There were tens of thousands that had been incorrectly tallied and therefore all had to be thrown out. There were tens of thousands of ballots that were printed incorrectly. And there were 3 different ballot forms. There was the one that you voted for president and all that. And then there were 2 constitutional amendments which had their own ballot. And one of them was printed correctly everywhere, the full verbiage of the amendment. And it was nothing, I don't remember, nothing important. And then the suffrage amendment was a very long ballot, and so maybe on purpose, maybe not, a bunch of them were abbreviated just to a paragraph saying this is what the amendment is, yes or no. All those had to be thrown out. And they found a very close tie between the liquor interests and all of these activities, everywhere from beating up people, going to the polls if you're in an area that was supportive of suffrage. It was tough to get to the polls to vote because they'd have their sluggers out there, they called them, to beat on you, to keep you away. And then all of these other things, these things being incorrectly tallied, the ballots being burned. Detroit, just in Detroit, there were tens of thousands of ballots that were counted and immediately burned. And so they couldn't recount those. The original count, the amendment lost by 594 votes or something like that. It was really close. And the recount, it lost by 700 and some votes. So it was still, even with all the cheating they did, it was still really close. And it was on the election, on the ballot again in 1913. It failed. And they thought then, because they didn't have this big turnout like they had for the presidential election, and it was 1919, I think, when women finally got the vote in Michigan. So that's still really kind of a mystery. It's pretty clear that big liquor was involved in beating this suffrage amendment, and there's enough evidence that it made sense to me, and so that's really what Will is trying to get behind and figure out, because Elizabeth is a suffragist. She's very involved in this campaign, and he wants to help her out, and he sees a way to do it, and so he gets involved in this technology and everything. So that was fun to write too. So that's the next one. That'll be in the fall.
Are your books ever going to go into paperback?
I sure hope so.
Because I could sell a whole lot of them if they were $14, $15 instead of $28.
Yeah.
To be honest with you, in this difficult time.
Right.
You know.
Yeah.
Who decides that, Dan?
It's the publisher. So St. Martin's, they have, with St. Martin's Minotaur Books, they have their publisher and editors and so on there, but there's a separate publisher for their paperbacks, and they have to sell it to their paperback group in order to get it done.
Would it help I, as a bookstore, call and ask if we could possibly have these as paperbacks?
Couldn't hurt. Couldn't hurt. Yeah, I ask, once a year, and see, and it seems like they're sort of right on the edge of doing it, but so far they haven't.
I'll do that because I believe in you. I
Oh,
would like
thank
to
you.
have lots more books of yours out there.
Thank you. So would I.
Yeah, sure.
When you look at your characters, Will and Elizabeth, and when you write from one book to the next, do you just look at that short time period, or do you have in your head kind of an arcing story over, of how their lives are going to turn out, say, 20 years after these? Do you just look at that, and that's as far as you have a vision of them, or do you have and then try to fit it into that?
None of the books end up being what I think they're going to be. So I will tell you, I think after Detroit Breakdown, Will does not have a long lifespan ahead of him. But he could he could probably hang on for another 20 years if he had to. I could keep him alive by some other miracle of medicine. But I really thought about their past, because I wanted to. One of the things that is challenging with writing any book is that the beginning of the story is the middle of their lives. They've already lived all of this stuff, and all of these things have gone on, and you really have to start in the middle. You can't start at the beginning of any story, and the characters are already fully formed people, and you want them to come across that way, not that their life began when I hit A on the computer keyboard. So I did try with Will. I thought, when I was first looking at the whole electric car thing, because I thought it would be, I didn't know really much of anything about electric cars back at the time, and I knew most people had no idea, and it was a hot button kind of topic. And so I looked at different companies, and then I came across Detroit Electric, which has by far the most documentation of who they were and what they made and all these kind of things. And William C. Anderson, the owner of the company, had 2 daughters. He didn't have a son, so I thought, let's give him Dad's name and have him have to live up to this very, very successful man who built this business from nothing. And Will grew up kind of with a silver spoon in his mouth, even though his dad's not that kind of guy. And so he feels this pressure to try to live up to what these expectations are. And the whole early part of his life, all he's trying to do is to live up to other people's expectations. And so that was really how I based him, and that felt like that worked. With Elizabeth, really, I knew her social standing. With the first book, I didn't have to know that much about her. She was Will's ex-fiancée, and she was a heroin addict at the time, and there's, all this other stuff. But in Motor City Shakedown, I learned a lot about her, and in Detroit Breakdown, I learned an incredible amount of information about who she was, because I had to try to get inside her head, and it was a great exercise for me in really learning that character, and a good way to do it, to try to figure out who somebody really is by trying to write as them. So the books that, have all veered off in different directions than where I thought they would go. I outline, and to sell it, the first book has to be complete. If you're writing fiction, you need to turn in a complete manuscript to the publisher. But after that, they will buy based on synopses. So I've got this, outline of what the book is going to be. That's what I think it's going to be. It makes sense, that's what it's going to be. And then I start writing it, and it starts going off over in this direction. And one thing I found is I got to let it go where it wants to. It's a very weird thing, and I think people think I'm crazy, but I hear it from enough writers that they have that same issue, where the story, the characters all have this power, and they take it. They take the story and do with it what they want to do with it. And I find, for me, writer's block is when I'm trying to force the story to go somewhere it doesn't want to go. And so I've learned what I need to do then is back up and find the place that doesn't quite seem right, and then think about that. And then, hopefully I don't have to go back too far. But it's easy to try to force a story to go where you think it ought to go, and it turns out that that's not where it needs to go.
So you didn't have the plot scheme in mind beforehand? You were more character-centered?
With the first book, I knew first how it would begin. I figured out the ending relatively early. With the second and third books, the killer changed while I was writing the book, which was very weird. I knew where it was going to go, and it wasn't going there. So we ended up with different killers. With Detroit Shuffle, because it's so based in real events, that one, while the killer did change, I have to say, so that's 3 in a row. The events happened in the same way because it was, really following what really happened during that time period.
Oh, it was based on real events.
Yeah, with the Detroit Electric scheme, the history in it is very real. All the electric car stuff is the way it happened. The murder mystery is not real. Motor City Shakedown, the gang war happened, and the people who die in my book died in reality. I've taken some liberties with how they die because I'm sticking Will and Elizabeth into the story, but the net result was the same, and the timeline is about the same. With Detroit Breakdown, it really goes away from events and goes into that place. So it was really about mental health treatment and Eloise Hospital during that time period. And then Detroit Shuffle gets back into the events with the election and the alderman scandal. Well, we should probably wrap up, I would guess. You think? So, yeah, it sounds like they're trying to clean up out there. So, but thank you very much. Dean has books in back. If anybody would like to buy a book, I'd certainly be happy to sign it for you. Or if you've brought any, I'd be happy to sign that for you as well. All right. Thank you.